Wow, what a beautiful spring day in the middle of this beautiful spring woodland scene. And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part, I created the 2D animation rig setup and 2D animations for my game's character. And in this part, I work on the 2D player movement mechanics, the 2D player movement collision, the 2D player movement state system, substate system, and tertiary state system for movement physics with speed setups, the use of this character controller without any pre-existing Unity character controller setups or physics, the character's movements with speed building, the character's movement on slopes, the character's movements walking up walls, walking on ceilings, walking back to the regular setup, the character's movement around spherical objects, the character's turning mobility, the character's skidding mobility, the character's sliding mobility, and probably some other stuff. This is a very long video, probably, that is encompassing a lot of different aspects, so in the description, as there always is, there is timestamps for each specific section of this video, so if you're only interested in seeing how one thing is created or coded or set up in the system for reference or something, then you can just go into the description and find that specific section. I try to make them as detailed as possible so you know what each section is. The first thing I did was set up the state and substate system. This is a very simple setup of systems. What we have is the player's grounded state and the player's in air state. These are the only two major setups of state systems we currently have, and then we have substate systems for these and tertiary substates, but I will talk about those later because they're not as important. The main system is the state and substate. I've used this in other devlogs, so I won't go into how it works specifically. It's not super complicated, it sounds complicated, but it's very simple. All we have is a enum of the player's current state, being if they are on the air and the ground. If they are, for example, on the ground, they will either move left or right relative to the character's position. They will rotate towards the ground. They will build speed to an amount. They will build speed by an acceleration amount. They will build speed by a deceleration amount and a stopping amount for when we do not build speed. They will lerp to their momentum that is built up as they are moving with a control amount. They will have a certain velocity of momentum applied to that character based on their speed amount. All of these values are set up as floats in the original setup of the script for the player to move the end of the current state system. Then we check all of our substate systems, or whichever substate system is currently active, and each of these have overrides. So for example, when turning, the character has no speed they can build into, they don't have any control over inputs, they can't turn, things like this, and this controls the final setup of movements. This is in very basics how the state and substate system works. It's just state systems are the basics of how a function works, how a player moves in a major capacity, so moving left and right and up and down and sticking to ground, and then substate systems override some of the values of these movements. As I have said before, state and substate systems are incredibly easy for games to add new movement capacities. For example, if I wanted to add driving to my game, all I would have to do is add a new substate for driving, and then I would just have the driving be overrides to our regular major states, and it would just change how the player moves. Next are the tertiary state systems. These are, as I said, less important. The main one of these is the speed state system and the air state system. These are for grounded movements particularly and aerial movements particularly, respectively. So the speed state system is a system that calculates what the player's current speed is and gives them values based on this. So for example, if the player's current speed is 0, we are in the walking state. This means we will build to a speed of 4. We will build this very quickly, and we will lose speed very quickly if we're not pressing any inputs. This is the slowest movement state. But for example, if we had a speed of 16, this could be the dashing substate of speed states, and this would have a higher target speed that we can build to, and a maybe a slower momentum because it's building speed. We're already at a high speed and we're just getting slightly faster, and it has a slightly dampened deacceleration. All this means is that I can adaptively change how different speed values are built, so that when this player is not moving very quickly, they can build speed very quickly, but when the player is already moving very quickly, they won't build speed as quickly, or they won't lose speed as quickly. It's just a very adaptive override for our speed accelerative values. While I'm talking about speed values, I may as well explain how the speed system setup works. So since the game doesn't have any physics, which I will probably explain in more detail as the devlog continues, but since the game doesn't have any physics, I just calculate speed as a float value. As you can see in the top left, this is a just a value from 0 to whatever the max speed is. I think it's 300. But that's just the value I set up. It's just a float value that is lerped based on a script called lerp speed, and by script I mean function called lerp speed. All this does is it takes in a value of our current input, our current target speed, our current acceleration, our current deceleration, and our current stopping amount. Our stopping amount is if we are actively trying to stop, so we're moving in a different direction, or we're not holding an input. So if we're running and we press no inputs, this would be our stopping amount. If we're running and we run uphill and our target speed is lowered, this would trigger our deacceleration. So if our target speed is more than our current actual speed, we will lerp to it by a value of our acceleration. If it is less, we will lerp to it by a value of our deacceleration. If we are not pressing any inputs, we will lerp this value by our stopping amount. And then this speed is just used in our movement scripts later on for how much we want to move the player each frame. But it's just a good way of controlling and monitoring how much the player can build speed, and also build speed over time. So if the player is moving across a flat surface for 30 seconds, they won't constantly build speed at a flat rate. They will build speed in different values. They will very quickly build initial speed, and then this would curve off based on however I am organizing the different speed states. The next thing I worked on was the actual movement in-game. This is how the player moves around the scene. If you look at the title of the video, you could see that this movement character doesn't use any Unity physics. This means that I don't use rigid body movements or any pre-built Unity character controllers. This is a character moving entirely with scripting that I have made. If you have seen some of my previous devlogs, when I did a 3D character, you would know that I made this exact same setup system-wise for a 3D character. It is at its core a very similar setup. If you are curious as to which is easiest to make, the 3D character took roughly a week to create to make it work correctly without any physics, while the 2D character took around an afternoon to create. The 2D character without any physics was significantly easier. The way the system works is we take the float value from before for calculating the character's speed. This is how fast we are going. Then we check if the character is facing left or right using the turning functions, but this is just, for now, is the character facing left or right based on our inputs. If the character is facing left, we apply our velocity to the left direction. If the character is facing right, we apply it to the right direction. This works in two separate ways. Is the character on the ground, or is the character in the air? If the character is in the air, this is the significantly easier portion. The character will move left or right and up and down by a variant of how much speed the character has. So for example, if they are moving at a speed of 10, they will move a value of 10 multiplied by the delta time on the right direction, so vector2.right. They will translate along this for however much speed they have. And then without physics, we just calculate if there is any collision in the way, and if there is, the player just won't move that direction. They will be stopped. Or they will move around it depending on what it is. But generally it's just the character moves left or right. If there is collision, they don't move left or right. In-air function is significantly easier than on-ground function, mostly because on-ground function for my game, has a setup for running along floors and grounding, which I will talk about how that works physics-wise in a moment, but how it works movement-wise is incredibly simple. It's the same way that regular movement in the game works. So when on ground, the character doesn't use a translate function. They will instead, if they are on the ground, use a raycast function. This is detecting if there is any more ground in front of the player. So if the player is moving at a speed of 10, we will detect how far the player would move left or right by a value of 10. We will check from this point upwards. So we'll check from the top where the player would be at this point, downwards towards the floor. We will check if there is any floor there. If there is a floor there, instead of having a character translate in that direction, we will place the character in this position. So we're just changing the character's transform position to wherever their raycast has located there to be a position that they could stand on. We will then check for any collision overlapping. So if there is any objects in this place that would interfere with the characters being placed there, we will not move the player to that position, and we will just move them to a relatively similar position that they could be placed in. But all we're doing for the movement is on the ground, we are checking in the direction of how far they could move in one frame, and we're checking where the ground is for that frame. We're returning the logic of the ground, so the ground's position, the ground's angle, which is used for rotation values, the ground's tagging, which is used for visual and audio values, and the ground's... Nope, just those 4 things. There isn't a 5th. Just the ground's information, and we're moving the character relative to the ground. It's not that difficult, if I'm being honest. It sounds pretty difficult if you haven't delved into using controllers just with your own specific scripting, but all you need to keep in mind is the player is just looking at where they would be positioned and deriving logic and placements based on that. As I mentioned, the player, when detecting when they're on the ground, detects what the ground's tagging is. This is for visual and audio information. I added this feature just because my good buddy Joe really likes when video games have specific audio for standing on different things, and also I think it's a nice touch. So what this does is it returns what the tagging for the ground is, and I just make a bunch of tags for different ground types, so normal, metal, water, mud, wood, and then when I make different sceneries and different areas, I can create different objects of these types, and the player will have different audio for standing on each of these different objects. So I can make a grassy area that transitions into a wooden area, have the collisions have different tags, and the player will have different audio and visual effects created based on what they are standing on. And this is incredibly easy. I have a visual script which creates effects and audio tied to the player. Audios are information classes that I have which can generate an audio piece based on a set of audios which are randomly chosen from, and a set of pitches that are randomly chosen from, and a set of volumes that are randomly chosen from to vary audio, and it plays one of those based on whatever we are standing on. So if the tagging was wood, we would detect that we are stood on a wooden thing. Whenever we need to play a step audio, we would search our audio information classes. So I have a group of audios that would be landing audio, stepping audio, and then effects. We check whichever one of these groups is relative to wood, and we play the respective effect, and also create the respective effect if one is needed. This just makes audio and visual design for different areas more distinct. Because if I'm having the player have little stepping animations and little stepping landing sounds, it's nice to vary it up. And I'm going to be honest, if I don't add it at this point, early in the process of the game, I'm going to forget and be way too lazy and preoccupied with complicated scripting to do it later in the project, so it's significantly easier just to nip it in the bud at this point and just add the funny audio script. We next have a rotation value for how the character rotates. This is Wicked easy. All I do is I have a script for rotating the player that is derived from what the upwards angle should be. So if the player should rotate to normal angling, I would just feed this vector to dot up. If not, and I want the character to rotate to the ground, I would feed them the ground normals. From this script, we derive what the angle of the floor is. This is significantly easier in two-dimensional space. Super easy. Wicked easy. Rotating to ground in 3D is bothersome and annoying. Rotating to ground in 2D is chef's kiss, wicked easy, took 2 seconds. We just find the angle of the floor and we change our Z angle of our quaternion to whatever this angle is. So if the wall is a 90-degree angle, we will change it to 90 degrees or 270 degrees depending on if the angle is left or right relative to our player. This is used with our floor detection, which is a variety of raycasts in front, behind, and at the center of our player, so we have enough information of the floor averaged out. And then we just rotate our value over time, so it's more smoothed out. But it does rotate very quickly, and this is just to make movement easier, since if you're going up a very quick slope, as in one that slopes upwards from a 0 to 90 degree angle quickly, we're not at a 90 degree angle, but the player hasn't rotated correctly in enough time. But also it's not so quickly that the snapping to new rotations looks jarring. The idea is to make the rotation look smooth, but not delayed relative to whatever our floor is. Next is the collision detection. This is the way that the player collides with things and detects things. It's very simple. It's just a series of 2D raycasts and 2D overlap circles or overlap sphere. I don't know the terminology for 2D collision yet. But all we do is we have raycasts from the player's center, the player's front, and the player's back. These are centered from the very center of the player's collision, where the collision capsule is, downwards for a set amount of time for however much I want this to be. If they find flaws, they will all average out the angle and positioning of the flooring. And this is just fed back to the player so they have the information on what the floor is. Since my idea for flooring in this game isn't going to be excessively complicated, not like my previous 3D game where it could be any level of small bumpy terrain, I'm mostly thinking a lot of large curved structures for flooring in my game, the 2D game, the one you're watching right now. So this isn't necessarily a complicated system check, especially because it's also in 2D. It's just mostly a precaution to check what the floor is and what we're working on, just to make the movement scripting work a lot better. One other check is we have the overlap sphere, which is used on certain movement scripting to check if there is any collision where the player would be positioned. Really simple, we just have a layer of what the player could be positioned through, so certain pickup items. For example, maybe the player could stand behind those, and therefore we won't include these in our overlap scripting. Instead, we will just check if there is any terrain, any enemies, any other such things, and if there is, this will result in a true bool being fed back to the player. So this is a bool function, meaning that there is a overlap of items or objects in this placement and the player cannot be easily placed there, but that's a very simple check. With the movement scripting, we use the information of what the ground is based on our player. So these are sent out based on the player's speed, forward, and then down to what the floor is. This is fed back to the player will then move to this position. If the player is on the ground, they cannot detect any flooring information. This is usually they have been moved to the air, so they have moved off the ground, they're moving into the air. In this sense, we continue to move on the ground just in case there is any issue for a few frames, enough that the player wouldn't be able to tell that they are just floating in the air for additional frames, but not so few that there would be any glitches arising from incorrect buggy collision and not being detected. This is more of a precautionary thing that I am adding, but I added in all of my games. It's just easier to do so rather than risk the issue of the player being set into the air and then set onto the ground within a 2 frame window It's just not very satisfying for the player to do, so it's easier to have this precaution, and in these senses we just use our default previous setup of movement, as in the player is just going to move in the direction they were continuing to move, even though there isn't any ground for them to stick onto. Next we have a system for different angular surfaces. These are the number of angular surfaces the player could stand on. Since the player can move in a 360-degree arc, this is any encompassing angle, but these all act differently depending on the angle of the surface, so I separated these into chunks, and then data is derived from these chunks depending on which angle the player is standing on. If the player is standing on a 0 to 12 degree angle, they have the 0 to 12 degree angle information. Then we have 12 to 35, then we have 35 to 55, then we have 55 to 80, 80 to 112, 112 to 165, and then 165 to 180, and then it just loops around to the other angles because we're running back on these certain angular surfaces. The reason these are separated such is just for a more dynamic effect on the player based on these angular surfaces, and so I can really influence the minutiae of how each angular surface will work on the player. But for you, the viewer, all you need to know is that certain angular surfaces will build and decrease speed at a certain amount if we are running up or down them. For example, the 45-degree angular surface could, when running down it, have a speed build of 2, but when running up it, have a speed loss of 4. So different angular surfaces will build and reduce speed at different amounts, and this is just a way to make it so that the player doesn't have a linear amount of speed loss or a linear amount of speed gain when going down slopes, and I can really complicatedly alter how much the player should build or lose speed on different angular surfaces. We also have different information for these states. For example, certain angular states will have the player fall off them at certain amounts. These are mostly restricted for angular surfaces above 90 degrees, so if the player is on a wall and they are losing speed, or their speed is at, I believe, around 2, they will just fall off the wall because the player can no longer be placed on the wall. Furthermore, we will only lose speed at certain speed values on each surface. For example, when running on a wall, if we're running up a wall at past a speed of, I think, around 12, we're not even going to lose speed because that's not fun for the player. Essentially, we're only going to lose speed when on higher up surfaces, when the player is already at a low enough speed to be affected. Otherwise, we're going to acknowledge that the player is running oh so quickly and not kill their speed at all, because that would just not be fun for gameplay. So as long as the player is moving and not stopping on these surfaces and not losing speed in some other alternative way, they should be able to run on these surfaces indefinitely. From this we also have the negative speed building logic. This is when the player is building speed past 0, they are building speed in the opposite direction, so at a very steep slope if the player has stopped pressing their inputs, they will build speed negatively and then be moved backwards. This is the easiest way I have for pushing the player down slopes when they are not supposed to be on them. So if you were to just run up a slope and then stop moving, this function would be played. It's the same way the player loses speed, only that the cap would be negative, so the player can move negative speed and they can just be pushed down the slope and then be building their speed back to 0 or an organic normal amount once they have been pushed off the steep slope. So if the player were to somehow just stop pressing the inputs at a very steep slope for no reason, they would be pushed back down it. It's mostly precaution for making the movement look good when the player is doing these specific things, but it's one of those things that unless a player is actively looking to make the game look silly, it won't really come up to be much of an issue or come up in gameplay at all. And that is about it for this devlog. You may note that there are multiple things in this devlog that I have not actually talked about at any point, and that's because I want to do something different with these devlogs. Instead of making them every week as I usually do, I will just make them whenever I have a system to talk about, which, given my development, will be multiple times per week. But this means the development videos won't be multiple different topics. They will be shorter and about a singular topic to help them be more organized, and also mean that I don't have to talk into a microphone for an hour.